The letter from the bank in Exeter arrived on a Tuesday, sealed with a cold finality that made the paper feel heavier than it was. Margaret Ashford read it standing in the kitchen of their rented cottage, her father's cough rattling through the thin walls behind her. 60 days. They had 60 days before the debt collectors would seize the cottage, the books, the herbarium specimens, everything her father had spent 40 years collecting. A lifetime of quiet scholarship, dismantled by a series of poor investments made by a cousin, now conveniently deceased. She folded the letter with steady hands and looked out the window. Beyond the neat hedgerows of Thornwick, past the chalk stream and the water meadows, rose the dark tree line of Blackwood Estate. No one in the village called it by its proper name. It was simply Ashworth's ground, spoken in lowered voices, often with a glance over the shoulder. The warnings had been drilled into Margaret since she arrived 6 months ago to care for her ailing father. Never cross the boundary wall. Never take the path through the beech grove. Never, under any circumstance, enter the Duke's estate. You'll hear things, old Mrs. Granger at the village shop had told her, gnarled fingers wrapping a parcel of tea. Screaming, some say. Others say the Duke himself walks the grounds at night, his face burned down to the skull, looking for trespassers to drag into that great black house. My nephew's wife's cousin was a maid there before the fire, she said. Margaret had not stayed to hear what the nephew's wife's cousin had said. She had little patience for superstition, a trait inherited from a father who had taught her to classify ghost stories alongside other varieties of nonsense. The world was made of observable truths, the structure of a seed pod, the function of a stamen, the way a plant's environment shaped its growth. These things could be understood. Everything else was distraction. But the bank letter changed the equation. The truth was simple. Her father would not survive the shame of debtor's prison, nor the damp of the workhouse. His lungs were already failing, his hands too weak to press specimens. Margaret's own modest skills, watercolor painting, a fluent command of Latin, the ability to identify 200 species of native flora, were worthless in the marriage market and nearly as worthless in the employment market. She was 24 years old, possessed of a dignity that men found unnerving and entirely without prospects. Then she remembered the orchid. Her father had spoken of it weeks ago, his voice alight with the old scholarly fire. The Blackwood ghost, Angricum nigrum, thought to be extinct in England for a century, but there's a colony, I'm certain of it, on the Duke's estate. The conditions are perfect. The old oak wood, the limestone seep. If a specimen could be obtained, Margaret, the Kew Society would pay 100 guineas, perhaps more. 100 guineas, enough to clear the debt and keep them housed for another year, enough time. She made the decision by mid-afternoon. By dusk, she was walking the boundary lane. The wall was old, built of flint and crumbling mortar, patched in places with rusted iron stakes. Margaret had noted the breach months ago, a section where a fallen oak had crushed the stone, creating a gap just wide enough for a person to slip through. She had never been tempted to use it, until now. She wore her plainest gray wool dress, serviceable boots, and carried a canvas satchel with a trowel, a glass specimen jar, and a folded square of damp linen. Nothing else. She told no one where she was going. The woods swallowed her quickly. Ancient beeches rose like pillars in a drowned cathedral, their roots buckling through the earth. Ferns brushed her skirts with wet fingers. Somewhere an owl called, a low 3-note lament. Margaret pressed forward, nodding landmarks. A lightning struck yew, a cairn of mossy stones, and recited the habitat requirements in her mind like a prayer. Damp shade, alkaline soil, old, undisturbed woodland. The orchid would be near water. She found the stream first, a thin silver thread running over chalk. She followed it uphill for 20 minutes, her boots sliding on wet leaves, the light failing from gray to charcoal. Then she saw it. A cluster of pale blooms, ghostly in the twilight, rising on slender stems from a fallen, moss-covered log. The flowers were white with a faint green veining, their petals narrow and tapering like little stars. Angricum nigrum, the blackwood ghost, more than a dozen healthy specimens, more than she had dared hope for. Margaret knelt in the damp leaf mold, her pulse a steady drum, and withdrew her trowel. She would take only one, a single mature plant with care not to damage the root system. The colony would survive. Her fingers had just touched the stem when iron clamped around her wrist. She did not scream. The shock was too complete, too absolute. One moment she was reaching for the orchid. The next, a hand had closed over her arm, large, ungloved, cold as river stone, and hauled her to her feet with a force that made her shoulder joint protest. "You are trespassing." The voice was not loud. It was worse than loud. It was ruined, scraped raw at the edges, the voice of a man who had breathed in fire and never fully exhaled it. It came from behind her, but so close she felt the words stir the hair at her temple. Margaret turned, or tried to. The grip on her wrist tightened, not painfully, but with the unmistakable pressure of absolute control. She saw a dark shape, taller than herself by a head, broad-shouldered against the dying light. She saw the glint of eyes, pale as winter frost, set in a face half hidden by shadow. Then the figure stepped back, pulling her with him, and she stumbled. "Walk," the voice commanded. "The house now." The grip shifted from her wrist to her elbow, a hard, formal custody. Her satchel was still on the ground. The orchid still waited, uprooted by inches, its pale petals trembling in the evening breeze. Margaret Ashford, botanist's daughter, realist, trespasser, lifted her chin and walked where the monster bid her, into the dark heart of Blackwood Hall. Part 2. The house emerged from the trees like a wound in the landscape, stone the color of old bone, windows dark as gouged-out eyes. Ivy had swallowed the eastern wing, thick ropes of it pulling at the masonry. The grand entrance portico sagged, one column leaning at a drunken angle. No lights burned in the lower floors. No servants appeared at the crunch of gravel. The Duke did not release her arm as they ascended the cracked steps. A heavy oak door, banded with iron, swung inward at his touch. Inside, the air was cold and still, thick with the smell of damp wool, old smoke, and something else, something green and living, like the breath of a conservatory left too long to its own devices. Candles flickered in sconces along the corridor. Margaret registered impressions in fragments. A vast staircase with a balustrade of carved blackthorn, portraits shrouded in linen, a chandelier lying on the floor like a fallen comet, its crystals scattered across the marble. The Duke limped. She noticed the uneven rhythm of his stride now, a heaviness in the left leg. The fire had not spared it. He brought her to a library. This room, at least, showed signs of habitation. A fire burned in the grate, banking the walls with orange light. Bookshelves climbed to the ceiling, crammed with leather-bound volumes. A massive desk dominated the center, heaped with papers, botanical prints, and a brass microscope that gleamed like a tiny cannon. The Duke released her at last and moved to the fireplace. He stood with his back to her, one hand braced against the mantel, the flames casting his shadow huge and wavering across the ceiling. "I will ask once," he said without turning, "what were you stealing from my land?" Margaret straightened her dress, a reflexive gesture of dignity. Her arm ached where he had held it. "I was not stealing, Your Grace. I was collecting a specimen, the Blackwood ghost orchid. I intended to take a single plant." "Without permission, on private land. By what definition is that not theft?" "By the definition that I would have left a note." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "In compensation, I am not a common poacher. I am a botanist." He turned. The firelight caught him full in the face, and Margaret understood why the village whispered. The right side of his face was handsome, almost brutally so, a strong jaw, a well-shaped mouth, an arch of brow that spoke of intelligence and pride. But the left side was a ruin. The skin was drawn tight, mottled pink and white, pulling the corner of his mouth into a slight, permanent grimace. The ear was misshapen, the hairline gone. His left eye, thank God, had been spared. And it regarded her now with a gray clarity, that was more unnerving than any disfigurement. A botanist, he repeated. The word came out with a twist of something that might have been bitter amusement. And you knew the orchid was here because. My father is John Ashford. He corresponded with your mother, the Duchess, in the years before her death. She mentioned the colony in her letters. Silent, the fire popped. A log shifted, sending up a shower of sparks. I see, the Duke said. His voice had gone quieter, the rawness deepening. So you knew whose land this was, you knew the warnings, and still you came. Yes. Why? Margaret met his eyes. The gray was not cold, she realized. It was the gray of a winter sea, deep and full of hidden currents. Because my father is dying, your grace. Not quickly, but certainly. We are in debt. The orchid would have bought us time. I did what I believed necessary. He studied her for a long moment. The silence stretched, pulled taut as a wire. Margaret felt herself being weighed, measured, categorized, a process she understood well. It was what she did with plants. She wondered what classification this scarred, grieving man was assigning her. Weed, parasite, or perhaps, a cultivated strain worth preserving. The orchid is not the rarest thing on this estate, he said at last. My mother's conservatory, did your father tell you of it? He said it was one of the finest private collections in England. Before the fire. Before the fire, the Duke agreed. It has been untouched for 8 years. The glass is broken. The frost and the damp have done their work, but some things survive. Some things always survive. He moved a step closer. The limp made the motion lurching, predatory. You will restore it. You will catalog what remains and bring it back to order. In exchange, I will give you your orchid, and I will pay you a sum for the work. Sufficient, shall we say, to address your family's debts. Margaret's breath caught. The offer was more than fair, it was miraculous. But the terms were implicit. She would be his prisoner or near enough for the duration. Blackwood Hall was miles from the village. Her reputation, already fragile, would not survive the association if it became known. If I refuse, she asked, then I will have you charged with trespass and attempted theft. Your father's name will not protect you. The magistrate is persuadable. The threat was delivered without heat, a simple statement of fact. Margaret felt a strange, unwilling respect stir beneath her fear. He was not a monster. He was a man who had been broken and had rebuilt himself into something hard and unsentimental. She recognized the shape of that survival. I will need to send word to my father, she said. He will worry. Write your letter. I will have it delivered. You may tell him you are visiting a friend. The details are your own. And the village, they will talk. Someone will have seen me. Let them talk. The Duke turned back to the fire, his ruined profile stark against the flames. The village has been talking about me for 8 years. It has done me no harm. A pause. And no good. Margaret looked around the library, the dust, the shrouded portraits, the single chair by the fire. A room built for a family, now occupied by a ghost. She thought of her father's cough, the bank letter, the pale flowers trembling on the dark log. Very well, she said. I accept your terms, your grace. Ashworth, he corrected without looking at her. The title is Ashworth. You may as well use it if we are to be colleagues. Outside the library windows, the moon had risen, cold and white, brushing the skeletal ribs of the ruined conservatory with silver. Somewhere in the dark house, a clock ticked, keeping its own lonely rhythm. Margaret Ashford had come to steal an orchid. She had been caught by a duke, and neither of them knew yet what seeds they had planted in the ash. Part 3. The conservatory was a cathedral of broken glass. Margaret stood in the doorway on her first morning, a ledger and pencil in hand, and felt something she had not expected, grief. Not for herself, but for the loss of what this place had been. The iron framework still stood, a graceful skeleton of arches and domes, but the glass panes were shattered in a dozen places, letting in rain and birds and the creeping cold. Potted trees, once espaliered against the walls, had burst their containers and sent roots questing through cracked flagstones. A grapevine thick as her wrist had swallowed the north wall entirely. Fungi fruited in the damp corners, pale and obscene. Yet life persisted. Through the decay, she spotted the gleam of camellia leaves, the stubborn green of ferns, the skeletal but living forms of roses trained along the southern arcade. A collection that had taken a duchess 40 years to build, reduced to this in a single night of fire and 8 years of neglect. She began the work that morning and did not stop until dusk. The Duke did not visit. He did not send a servant. Margaret saw no one except the maid, a silent, middle-aged woman called Baines who brought her a tray of bread, cheese, and cold tea at midday and then vanished. The isolation was absolute. She might have been the last woman alive on the moon. But she felt watched. Every time she straightened from her work, every time she paused to note a measurement or sketch a surviving specimen, the sensation prickled at the back of her neck. A presence behind the dirty glass. A shadow in the gallery window above. She never caught him looking. She only ever saw the aftermath, a curtain falling back into place, the echo of a retreating footstep on stone. On the third day, she left a gift on his desk. It was a rhizome of blue iris, pulled from the wreckage of the water garden, still viable despite the neglect. She wrapped it in damp moss, placed it in a small terracotta pot, and set it on the corner of his desk with a note, Iris versicolor. Survived the freeze. Thought you should know. When she returned to the conservatory the next morning, the iris was gone from his desk. In its place was a book, an 1802 folio on the orchids of Devonshire, open to a hand-colored plate of the Blackwood ghost. No note, no acknowledgement, just the book. This became their pattern. She would leave a specimen, a cutting, a small restoration. He would leave a book, a tool, a botanical print from his mother's collection. They did not speak, but the silence between them changed texture from something cold and hostile to something attentive. The journal came in the second week. Margaret found it wedged behind a loose stone in the conservatory wall, wrapped in oilcloth, deliberately hidden. The hand was feminine, elegant, the ink faded to sepia. The Journal of Helena, Duchess of Ashworth, concerning the Blackwood collection, 1805–1812. She read it in her room that night, by the light of a single candle. The Duchess had been a formidable woman, learned, precise, passionate about her plants in a way that her son had inherited. The early entries were full of bright enthusiasm. A new shipment of rhododendrons from the Himalayas, a successful grafting of a French rose onto English stock, the Duke, the current Duke's father, building her a heated propagating house. But the later entries darkened. References to her son began to appear. A, she called him, for Alexander, and to his young wife, C, and their child. C grows more distant, is consumed by his work, blind to her moods. I have tried to speak to him, but he will not hear. She is not suited to this life. She hates the country. She hates the silence. She hates, I think, the plants most of all because they take what she believes should be hers. The final entry was dated 3 days before the fire. Something is broken in this house. I feel it like a canker in a rose stem spreading invisibly beneath the bark. I do not know if I can reach them. God help me. God help us all. Margaret closed the journal and stared at the candle flame until her eyes burned. The Duchess had seen it coming. Perhaps not the fire itself, but the rot that preceded it. And the Duke, Alexander, had lived with that knowledge for 8 years alone. The next morning, she did not leave a specimen. She waited until she heard his step in the corridor outside the library, the familiar uneven rhythm, and then she pushed open the door and stepped inside without knocking. He was at his desk, a pen in his hand, a letter half-written. He looked up, startled, and for a moment she saw him unguarded, the exhaustion in his eyes, the gray threading through his dark hair, the way his ruined face tightened with the instinct to turn away. "Miss Ashford," he set down the pen, "you require something." "I found your mother's journal." Silence, the clock on the mantel ticked, the fire murmured. Where? His voice was flat. Hidden in the conservatory. She wanted someone to find it. She wanted my father to find it. He never did. The Duke pushed back his chair and rose, turning to the window. His back was rigid, his shoulders set. And now you have read things that are not your concern. What do you want? An explanation, a confession. The village already has its stories. Take your pick. I do not want a confession. Margaret moved closer, stopping at the edge of the desk. The brass microscope glinted between them. I want to know why you let the world think you are dead. He turned his head just slightly so the ruined profile caught the light. Because I am dead. What you see is a ghost, Miss Ashford. Do not mistake it for a man. A ghost would not have saved the iris. A ghost would not care if the Blackwood ghost survived on his land. A ghost would not have offered a stranger employment rather than see her face debtor's prison. She held his reflected gaze in the window glass. You are not dead, Your Grace. You are only buried. There is a difference. The silence that followed was the longest of her life. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to strain to hear it. You are the first person in 8 years who has looked at my face and not flinched. Do you know that? I know, Margaret said quietly. I have catalogued the phenomenon. A sound escaped him, not a laugh but something close, a release of breath, a crack in the stonework. Show me the conservatory, he said. Show me what you have done. And together, the unlikely pair walked into the ruined glass cathedral, where the first rose of the season had begun, against all odds, to bloom. Part 4. Lord Philip Latimer arrived on a Thursday, bringing disaster with him. Margaret was in the conservatory when she heard the commotion, a horse's hooves on gravel, raised voices, the slam of the front door echoing through the hall like a gunshot. She straightened from her work, heart suddenly hammering. No one came to Blackwood Hall. No one dared. The tradesmen left deliveries at the gatehouse. The tenants' rents were collected by a steward in the village. The Duke had isolated himself with the thoroughness of a Carthusian monk. She crossed to the gallery door and peered through the grimy glass. A sleek black carriage stood in the drive, its horses steaming, and descending from it, dressed in a coat of bottle green superfine that had certainly never been purchased on a country income, was the broad, florid figure of Lord Philip Latimer. Margaret's blood chilled. Latimer was the son of a baronet, possessed of 2,000 acres in Somerset and an unshakable conviction that the world owed him whatever he desired. He had desired Margaret since her first week in Thornwick, when she had made the error of conversing with him at a village assembly about botanical classification. He had taken her erudition as a challenge, her reserve as a flirtation, her repeated refusals as the coy prelude to eventual surrender. He did not love her. He simply could not tolerate the idea that something in his orbit might resist his pull. And he had found her. She slipped through the servants' passages, a route she had learned in her weeks of isolation, and positioned herself behind the door to the great hall. It stood ajar, granting her a sliver of view. The Duke was there, standing before the cold hearth. He had clearly come from his study. His coat was off, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, revealing the scarring that twisted down his left forearm. He faced Latimer with the stillness of a wolf waiting to see if the intruder would run. Your Grace. Latimer's bow was correct, but the smirk beneath it was not. I apologize for the unannounced visit. I was given to understand a young lady of my acquaintance is staying with you, a Miss Margaret Ashford. Your understanding is mistaken. The Duke's voice was ice. Miss Ashford is not staying with me. She is employed by me as a botanical consultant. Employed. Latimer repeated the word as if it were an obscenity. A young, unmarried woman living alone in a bachelor duke's house with no chaperone and no family. Employed. How? Modern. The Duke did not move. State your business, Latimer, or leave my property. My business is Miss Ashford. Latimer's smirk hardened into something uglier. Her father is ill and she vanished from the village 3 weeks ago. The servants talk, Your Grace. The tradesmen talk. The maid you dismissed for gossiping talked a great deal before she left the county. The story is already spreading, the ruined duke, the innocent girl, the secret imprisonment. I am here to escort Miss Ashford back to her family before the scandal destroys what remains of her prospects." Margaret stepped into the hall. Both men turned. Latimer's expression flickered, triumph, possessiveness, and a flash of genuine shock at seeing her in a plain wool dress with dirt under her fingernails and a streak of leaf mold on her cheek. "Miss Ashford," Latimer moved toward her, hand extended. "You are safe now. I have brought a magistrate. There has been a misunderstanding, Lord Latimer." Margaret's voice was clear and cold, carrying through the ruined hall. "I am not a prisoner. I am here by my own choice, conducting paid work. His Grace has been entirely honorable. The magistrate is unnecessary." The lie was smooth. She did not look at the Duke. She did not dare. Latimer's hand dropped. The fury that crossed his face was brief but unguarded, a flash of true rage, quickly suppressed. "You expect me to believe that you have been living unchaperoned in this house for weeks and nothing improper has occurred. I expect you to believe the evidence of your senses. I am well, I am unharmed, and I am working. I will return to the village when my contract is complete." The word contract was a masterstroke. It shifted the conversation from morality to business, a realm where even Latimer had to tread carefully. He stood a moment, mouth working, and then turned his venom on the Duke. "This is not over, Ashworth. The county will hear of this. The ton will hear of it. A man like you, a recluse, a cripple, a man whose own wife chose death over his company, has no business keeping a gentlewoman under his roof. I will return, and when I do, I will bring the full weight of the law." He left without a bow. The door slammed. The carriage wheels crunched away. Silence flooded back into the hall. Margaret stood rooted to the flagstones, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her temples. The Duke had not moved. His face was a mask, the scarred side rigid, the whole side pale. "Your Grace, you lied for me." He turned to look at her, and the expression in his gray eyes was something she could not read. Astonishment, yes, but also something rawer. "You put yourself in front of scandal to protect a man you barely know. Why?" "Because Lord Latimer is a bully," Margaret said, "and because you did not deserve what he said about your wife." The words hung in the air. The Duke flinched, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but she saw it. "You know nothing about my wife," he said, his ruined voice dropping to a whisper. "Nothing." "Then tell me." Margaret stepped closer, close enough to see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands had curled into fists at his sides. "Tell me the truth, because Latimer knows something. He spoke of your wife with too much detail. He has been investigating you, and whatever he finds he will use." The Duke stared at her. For a long, terrible moment she thought he would order her from the house. Instead, he reached out and took her wrist, the same wrist he had seized that first night, but his grip was different now. Gentle, almost pleading. "Not here," he said. "Come with me." He led her not to the library, not to the conservatory, but to the sealed door at the end of the east corridor, the door she had passed 100 times and never seen opened. The west wing. The burned wing. He produced a key from his coat, an old iron thing, and fitted it to the lock. "Are you certain?" Margaret asked. "No." The Duke pushed the door open, and the smell of old smoke rolled out like a confession. "But you asked for the truth, and God help me, I think you are the only person I can bear to tell it to." Part 5. The West Wing was a tomb. They walked through corridors where the wallpaper had peeled in long, blackened strips, revealing the lath beneath. The ceilings were stained with smoke shadows, great blooms of soot that had flowered upward from the fire's heart. Margaret pulled her shawl over her nose against the acrid ghost of burned timber, but it was not the physical destruction that tightened her chest. It was the silence. A dead silence, heavier than any she had known, as if the walls themselves were holding breath. The Duke did not speak as he led her. His limp was more pronounced here. His shoulders hunched against the weight of memory. They passed a nursery door, its paint blistered, a child's wooden horse lying on its side in the corridor beyond. Margaret's heart clenched. She did not pause. The ballroom was the last door, a vast double archway that opened onto devastation. The fire had burned hottest here. The floor was a black pit where the beams had given way, now repaired with raw timber, a patchwork of salvage. The chandelier, a new one or the old one rehung, glittered cold above them, its candles unlit. The windows were boarded over. The only light came from the Duke's lamp, swinging in his hand. This is where it happened. He set the lamp on a surviving sideboard, its gilt blackened. The fire, the death, all of it. Margaret stood in the center of the ruined room, feeling the cold seep through her boots. "Tell me." The Duke leaned against the wall, his scarred cheek catching the lamplight. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with the air of a man lancing a wound, he began. "I married Catherine when I was 24. She was beautiful, vivacious. The daughter of an earl, not a wealthy one but well-connected. My mother disapproved. She saw something in Catherine that I could not see. Desperation, perhaps. A hunger for the title, the estate, the standing. But I was young. I was in love." He paused, staring at the boarded windows as if he could see through them to the past. The first year was acceptable. The second year was not. Catherine hated Blackwood. She hated the country, the silence, the endless rain. She hated my work, my plants, my journals, my hours in the conservatory with my mother. She wanted London. She wanted society. She wanted me to be a different man, and I could not be that man, and she could not forgive me for it. When our son was born, I thought it might save us. A child to bind us together, but Catherine did not want a child. She wanted an heir, a bargaining counter, a way to secure her position. She did not want him. She never held him if a nurse could be summoned. She never sang to him. She looked at him and saw a chain. The word chain fell into the silence like a stone into deep water. Margaret did not move. The night of the fire, we argued. I cannot even remember the subject, something trivial, some imagined slight, but Catherine was not herself. She had been drinking, I think, and taking things from the apothecary that made her eyes strange. She told me she was leaving, taking our son, going to London to live with a man who understood her. I said she could go, but the boy would stay. He was the heir. He belonged to Blackwood. The Duke's voice cracked, the first break in his composure. She ran from the room. I thought she had gone to pack. I went to the nursery to look in on our son. He was sleeping. I kissed his head. I told him I would always protect him. His hand rose to his scarred face, fingers tracing the ruined skin. I was a fool. Catherine went to the ballroom. She knew I kept lamp oil there for the chandeliers. She poured it across the floor. She lit it. She intended, I think, to cause a distraction, to draw me to the flames while she took the boy and escaped through the servants' stairs. But fire does not obey intentions. The fire found the drapes. It found the old dry wood of the floor. It moved faster than she could have imagined. She ran back to the nursery. She grabbed our son, but the corridor was already burning. The smoke. He closed his eyes. I heard the screaming. I ran. I pulled a tapestry down here, this one. He touched the blackened fabric still hanging against one wall, and I wrapped myself in it and went into the nursery after them. Catherine was on the floor. The smoke had taken her, our son. His voice broke entirely. He was in her arms. She had tried to shield him. It was not enough. I carried them both out, but they were gone. They were both gone, and he touched his face again. I survived. I do not know why. I have asked God that question every day for 8 years, and he has never answered. The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret felt tears on her cheeks, cold in the dead air, but she did not wipe them away. She did not speak. She understood with the clarity of instinct that this was not a moment for comfort. This was a moment for witness. She crossed the ruined floor, her boots crunching on debris, and stopped beside him, not touching him, not speaking, just standing, a steady presence in the ash. After what felt like an hour, the Duke opened his eyes and looked at her. The gray was wet, shattered, utterly unguarded. "Now you know," he said. "Now you know what I am. A man who failed his wife, who failed his son, who let his family burn because he was too blind to see what was happening. "No," Margaret said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the dead room like a bell. "You are not dead, Your Grace. You are only buried, and I think you have been buried long enough." She did not reach for him. She did not offer a hand. She simply stood there, solid and unflinching, and let her presence speak for her. And in the blackened heart of Blackwood Hall, the Duke of Ashworth bowed his head and wept. Part 6. The bloom appeared on a morning in early October, when the autumn light slanted amber through the repaired glass of the conservatory. Margaret had been working for 6 weeks. The transformation was not complete. A full restoration would take years, but the bones of the Duchess's collection had been salvaged. The camellias had been pruned and fed, the ferns divided, the grapevine tamed to a trellis. And in the southeast corner, where a particular angle of morning sun fell on a sheltered bed, a single bud had begun to swell on a rosebush Margaret had dismissed as dead. She recognized the variety now after weeks of cross-referencing the Duchess's journals. Rosa Helena's Pride, a hybrid tea rose the Duchess had been developing before her death, a cross between a French damask and a wild English briar. It had been thought lost, a casualty of the fire, but it had survived. Buried in ash, frozen by frost, choked by neglect, it had endured. The bud opened on a Tuesday. The petals were a deep apricot at the center, fatting to cream at the edges with a fragrance that stopped Margaret in her tracks. Not sweet, complex, spice and honey and something greener underneath, like cut stems after rain. She was still standing before it, her pruning shears forgotten in her hand, when she heard the Duke's uneven step behind her. "What is it?" His voice had changed in the past weeks. The rawness remained, but it was softer now, less guarded. He had begun joining her in the conservatory in the afternoons, sitting on a bench while she worked, sometimes reading, sometimes simply watching the light move across the glass. "Your mother's rose." Margaret stepped aside so he could see. "It survived after everything, it survived." The Duke approached slowly, his eyes fixed on the bloom. He raised his hand and touched one of the petals with a fingertip, the gesture reverent. "She called it Helena's Pride. She said it would be her legacy." His voice caught. "I thought it was destroyed. I thought everything was destroyed." "Not everything." Margaret set down her shears. "The orchid survived, the iris, the rose, and you, Your Grace, you survived. The question is what you intend to do about it." He looked at her then, and something in his expression had shifted, a door opening, a light entering a room that had been dark for a very long time. "I intend to write to the Horticultural Society, the Royal Society at Kew. My mother's work deserves to be known, and," he paused, "I intend to visit London before Christmas. I have been a ghost long enough." Margaret felt her heart lift, a wild, dangerous hope. She had allowed herself to feel more for this scarred, grieving man than was wise. She knew it. She had known it for weeks, perhaps from the moment he had left the Iris book on her desk. But she had also known the impossibility of it. He was a duke. She was a botanist's daughter, penniless, her reputation hanging by a thread. "London," she said, keeping her voice steady. "You will be the talk of the season, the Duke who returned from the dead. The Duke who was dragged back by a trespasser with a trowel." His mouth quirked, the unburned side, the one that could still smile. "I shall tell them you beat me about the head until I saw sense. I shall not contradict the account." They stood together, looking at the rose, and Margaret thought, "This is enough. Whatever comes, this moment is enough." It was not enough. Lord Latimer returned the following week, and this time he did not come alone. The scandal broke in London before it reached Thornwick. A gossip column, printed in a paper with a circulation of 10,000, carried the headline, "Reclusive Duke's Secret Prisoner, a young lady of quality held against her will." The article named Margaret. It described her father's illness, her disappearance from the village, her confinement at Blackwood Hall. It quoted an unnamed source, a gentleman of unimpeachable character, who claimed to have attempted a rescue and been turned away at the door. Margaret read the paper in the library, her hands trembling so badly the pages rattled. The Duke stood at the window, his back to her, his posture rigid. "Latimer," he said. The name came out like a curse. "What do we do?" Margaret's voice was steady, but the steadiness cost her. The article had destroyed her. No employer would hire her now. No family would receive her. Her father would die in debtor's prison, and it would be her fault. The Duke turned. His face was pale, the scars stark against his skin. "I will make a statement. I will tell the truth." "The truth will not matter. Latimer has already shaped the story. Any denial will be seen as a cover-up. You know how society works." She set the paper down carefully as if it were a dead thing. "The only way to protect yourself is to distance yourself from me. Publicly. You must say I deceived you. You must say I claim to be a widow or a married woman. You must cast me off." "I will not." The words were hard, unyielding. "I will not sacrifice you to save myself." "Then Latimer wins." Margaret rose from her chair. The dignity she had cultivated, the composure she had worn like armor, was cracking, and she did not care if he saw it. "He wins, Your Grace. He will have you up on charges of abduction. He will have me branded a fallen woman. And your mother's rose, your return to London, everything you have fought for these past weeks, it will all be ash. Again." "I do not care about London." The Duke moved toward her, his limp more pronounced, his gray eyes burning. "I care about—" "Stop." Margaret held up a hand. "Do not say something you cannot take back. Do not make this harder than it already is." The silence stretched, taut and terrible. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. And Margaret Ashford realized with a clarity that cut like a blade what she had to do. "I will leave tonight," she said. "Before anyone in the village sees the paper, I will go to my father. I will tell him. I will tell him the work ended. I will not mention the scandal. When Latimer's questions come, you will say I abandoned my position. You will say you dismissed me the day he first visited. You will say whatever you must to protect this house and your name." "And what of your name?" The Duke's voice was rough, anguished. "What of your reputation?" "My reputation was fragile to begin with. I am a woman who works. I am a woman who trespassed on a duke's estate to steal an orchid. I am not a lady, Your Grace. I never was. Let them say what they like. I will endure." She did not wait for his response. She turned and walked from the library, her back straight, her steps measured. She had packed her small bag by nightfall. She did not say goodbye. And the Duke, standing at his dark window, watched her vanish into the trees the way she had come, a gray figure swallowed by the greater gray of dusk. He did not follow. He did not call out, but his hand, pressed flat against the cold glass, trembled. The rose bloomed on, uncut, in the silent conservatory. Part 7. Thornwick was brutal. Margaret returned to the village and found herself a pariah. The scandal had preceded her, not the London paper, not yet, but the village's own version of the story, carried by servants' whispers and the delighted malice of those who had always found her too proud, too clever, too unwilling to simper. The women of the parish turned their backs at the market. The rector's wife crossed the street to avoid her. Children were pulled indoors when she walked past. Only her father remained unchanged. He was too ill, too consumed by his failing body to absorb the gossip. Margaret told him the work at Blackwood had ended amicably, that she had been paid, that the debts would be settled. She did not mention the Duke. She did not mention the rose. The bank accepted the payment. The cottage was secure, but Margaret's place in the world was gone. She endured the public assemblies because she refused to hide. She attended church on Sundays because her absence would be a victory for her enemies. She sat in the Ashford pew, her back straight, her prayer book open, while the congregation whispered behind her. The rector's sermon on the sin of pride felt pointed. She did not flinch. Lord Latimer visited her on the third Sunday after her return. He cornered her in the churchyard, his smile oil-smooth, his hand reaching for her elbow. "A tragic business," he said, but perhaps not irreparable. I am still willing to offer my protection, Miss Ashford. A small ceremony in London, away from prying eyes. I have a house in town. You would be comfortable." Margaret looked at his hand on her arm. She looked at his face, at the smug certainty in his eyes. And she said, very quietly, "Remove your hand, Lord Latimer, or I will remove it for you." He laughed. "You have no other prospects, no other protector. Ashworth has abandoned you, as I knew he would. You are soiled goods, my dear. Be grateful for the offer." "The offer is declined. It will always be declined. I would rather clean fish at the harbor than accept your protection." She pulled her arm free. "Do not approach me again." His expression flickered, the same flash of rage she had seen at Blackwood. Then it smoothed over. "As you wish. But when you are destitute, when your father is dead and your cottage is sold, do not come crawling to me." She walked away. She did not look back. That night she wrote the letter. It was not a plea. She would not plead. She would not ask for rescue or declare feelings she had no right to declare. Instead, she wrote a simple statement of intent. She informed the Duke that the London scandal had reached the county magistrates. She informed him that Lord Latimer was building a legal case for abduction. She informed him that she intended to travel to London herself, to present testimony before the magistrate that she had entered his estate freely, that she had been employed willingly, that no impropriety had occurred. She did not ask his permission. She did not ask for his help. She sealed the letter with wax and sent it by the village post. The assembly rooms at Thornwick were a modest affair, a long hall above the coaching inn, used for dances, meetings, and the quarterly magistrates' court. On the evening of November the 5th, they were hosting a subscription dance, the last before Advent. Margaret had not intended to attend, but her father, in a rare moment of lucidity, had pressed her hand and said, "Do not let them win, my dear. Do not let them see you beaten." She wore her best dress, a dark blue silk, 3 years out of fashion, with a neckline higher than modesty required. She did not dance. She stood at the edge of the room, a cup of lukewarm punch in her hand, and endured the pointed stares and the whispered comments and the empty circle of floor around her. Lord Latimer was there, of course. He was dancing with the squire's daughter, a girl of 17 with ringlets and a vacant smile. He caught Margaret's eye across the room and raised his glass in a mocking toast. She did not acknowledge it. The music was a country reel, bright and insistent. The room was warm with candlelight and the press of bodies. Margaret counted the minutes until she could leave, until she could return to the cottage and her father's quiet breathing and the small, hard comfort of having survived another day. Then the doors opened and the music stopped. He stood in the doorway, a tall figure in black evening clothes, a greatcoat over his shoulders, his scarred face fully visible in the candlelight. He had not hidden it. He had not turned his scarred side away. He stood square to the room, his gray eyes scanning the crowd, and when they found Margaret, they stopped. The Duke of Ashworth walked into the Thornwick assembly rooms, and the crowd parted before him like water before a stone. The whispers rose, not the usual malicious murmur, but something different. Shock, disbelief. The Duke had not been seen in public for 8 years. The Duke was a monster. The Duke was dead. He was not dead, he was here. He crossed the floor with his uneven stride, past the frozen musicians, past Lord Latimer, whose face had gone the color of old cheese, past the squire's daughter with her mouth hanging open. He stopped before Margaret. The silence in the room was absolute. "Miss Ashford," his ruined voice carried through the hall, "I received your letter." "My lord," Margaret began, but he raised a hand. "I have come to make a public statement. You may all bear witness." He turned, addressing the room, and Margaret saw the tremor in his hands, the cost of every word. "This woman is not my prisoner. She never was. She is not my mistress. She never was. She is the finest botanist I have ever known, the restorer of my mother's collection, and the sole reason I am standing before you tonight instead of rotting in a dark house. She entered my estate without permission, for which I forgave her. She remained without a chaperone, for which I take full responsibility. Any man who impugns her character will answer to me." He turned back to Margaret. And then, in front of the assembled gentry of Thornwick, in front of Lord Latimer's bulging eyes and the squire's daughter's gasp, Alexander Ashworth, Duke of Blackwood, lowered himself to one knee. "My mother's rose bloomed," he said, his voice rough and low, meant only for her. "Against all odds, in the ash. I thought you should know." Margaret stared down at him. The Duke of Ashworth, the monster, the ghost, the man who had not set foot in the world for 8 years, was kneeling on the scuffed floor of a provincial assembly room, his ruined face upturned, his gray eyes bright with a fear and hope she recognized. "I am not here to rescue you," he said. "I am here because I cannot live buried any longer. I am here because you saw a ghost and called it a man. I wish to become that man." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small pot, the blue iris, the first gift she had left on his desk, now healthy and flowering. "With you, if you will have me." The silence stretched, the candles flickered, and Margaret Ashford, botanist's daughter, trespasser, woman of quiet dignity and impossible courage, reached down and took the pot from his hands. "The iris survived," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were wet. "I am glad." He rose. He did not touch her, not yet. But he stood beside her, solid and real and alive, and faced the room as her equal. "Get up," Margaret said to Lord Latimer, who had sunk onto a chair, his face a mask of thwarted fury. "Your case is over. Your gossip is spent. The Duke and I will marry, and you will find another woman to harass. I suggest you choose one with poorer aim." A sound rippled through the room, not laughter quite, but something close. The release of tension, the breaking of a spell. The musicians, uncertain, struck up a waltz, and the Duke of Ashworth, for the first time in 8 years, offered his hand to a woman and led her onto the floor. They danced. He was not graceful. The limp made his steps uneven, his turns too careful. She did not care. She held his hand and matched his rhythm and let the candlelight wash over them both. "Your Grace," she said, as they turned beneath the chandelier. "Alexander," he corrected, "to you always." Alexander. The name felt new in her mouth, a seed planted in fresh soil. The orchid, the Blackwood ghost. I never did collect my specimen. He looked down at her, and the smile that crossed his face, the whole face, the burned side and the whole side, was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "It will still be there," he said. "Tomorrow, and the day after, and every spring as long as the wood stands, I will show you." The waltz carried them across the floor, past the watching faces, past the wreckage of old scandals and old griefs. Outside, the November wind was rising. Inside, the candles burned steady. And in the dark woods of Blackwood, beneath the winter moon, a colony of pale flowers waited, ghostly, enduring, impossible for the spring.